Mass psychology. Mass psychology explains why cruelty gains approval precisely when individuals might privately reject it. When people act alone, they are capable of nuance, doubt, and moral hesitation, but in crowds, behavior shifts, the individual mind dissolves into collective emotion, fear spreads faster than reason, and certainty becomes more valuable than truth. In this state, people do not evaluate actions by ethical depth, but by emotional alignment with the group. What feels strong is what feels shared, and cruelty, when publicly endorsed, creates that shared feeling instantly. Crowds are highly sensitive to threat. Real or perceived danger activates a search for protection. The group does not ask who is right, it asks who can secure survival. This is why harsh rhetoric, public punishment, and uncompromising posture resonate so powerfully in times of crisis. They offer a simple answer to complex anxiety. The crowd feels relieved when someone appears willing to act without hesitation. That relief is mistaken for trust. Mass psychology also reduces responsibility. When many people move in the same direction, individual accountability fades, actions feel less personal, decisions feel less owned, cruelty becomes easier because it is distributed across the group. No one feels fully responsible for outcomes. The phrase, "everyone agrees," replaces moral reflection. This diffusion of responsibility allows behaviors that individuals might resist alone to feel acceptable collectively. Another critical element is emotional contagion. Strong emotions spread faster than careful thought. Fear, anger, and outrage travel instantly through crowds. These emotions narrow attention and simplify judgment. They divide the world into allies and enemies, order and chaos, us and them. Cruelty thrives in this binary environment because it offers decisive separation. Mercy complicates boundaries. It asks for empathy toward those defined as threats, and empathy weakens emotional unity. Empathy fractures the group's shared hostility. This is why mercy feels destabilizing in mass contexts. Crowds also crave symbols. Strong leaders, harsh punishments, and dramatic gestures function as emotional anchors. They provide focus and coherence. Cruelty, when visible, becomes a symbol of control. It reassures the crowd that someone is in charge. Mercy lacks the same visual force. It does not produce spectacle. It produces absence, absence of violence, absence of retaliation, absence of drama, and absence does not mobilize masses. Mass psychology is also shaped by insecurity. When people feel economically, politically, or culturally unstable, they seek simplicity. Cruelty simplifies. It reduces complex social problems to identifiable enemies and clear responses. Mercy demands complexity. It acknowledges context, motivation, and possibility of change. This cognitive demand feels exhausting to anxious crowds. Simplicity wins not because it is accurate, but because it is easier to absorb. History shows that crowds rarely initiate cruelty alone. They respond to cues. When authority legitimizes harshness, the crowd follows. When cruelty is framed as protection, justice, or necessity, mass approval grows rapidly. The crowd does not analyze consequences. It mirrors confidence. If the leader appears certain, the crowd feels safe. Certainty becomes contagious, even when it is destructive. Another paradox of mass psychology is moral reversal. In crowds, restraint can appear suspicious. Those who hesitate may be seen as disloyal or weak. Mercy becomes suspect because it interrupts momentum. Once a collective emotional direction is established, anything that slows it feels like sabotage. This is why crowds often punish restraint more harshly than aggression. They interpret hesitation as threat to unity. Over time, this dynamic creates a dangerous feedback loop. Leaders observe that harshness produces applause. They escalate severity to maintain emotional control. The crowd grows accustomed to intensity. What once shocked becomes normal. What once required justification becomes expectation. Cruelty escalates not because people become more evil, but because emotional thresholds shift. Mass psychology explains why societies later express regret. They look back and ask how they accepted what they once tolerated. The answer is not ignorance, but immersion. In the moment, the crowd felt justified. It felt protected. It felt aligned. With distance, individual moral clarity returns, but distance always comes too late. Mercy struggles in mass psychology because it speaks to individuals, not to crowds. It requires reflection, not reaction. It operates through patience, not spectacle, and crowds rarely reward patience, they reward momentum. This is why cruelty appears powerful in collective settings. It mobilizes emotion. It simplifies identity. It reinforces belonging. Mercy, by contrast, asks the crowd to slow down, to feel uncertainty, to accept risk, and uncertainty is the one thing mass psychology resists most. Understanding this does not excuse cruelty. It explains its appeal. It reveals that cruelty's power is not moral or strategic, but psychological. It thrives on fear, anonymity, and emotional alignment. And it fades when individuals regain agency and reflection. Mass psychology shows us a hard truth: cruelty feels strong when people stop thinking alone and start feeling together. Mercy feels risky because it interrupts that shared feeling and returns responsibility to the individual, and responsibility is always heavier than fear. Mass psychology. Mass psychology explains why cruelty gains approval precisely when individuals might privately reject it. When people act alone, they are capable of nuance, doubt, and moral hesitation. But in crowds, behavior shifts, the individual mind dissolves into collective emotion, fear spreads faster than reason, and certainty becomes more valuable than truth. In this state, people do not evaluate actions by ethical depth, but by emotional alignment with the group. What feels strong is what feels shared, and cruelty, when publicly endorsed, creates that shared feeling instantly. Crowds are highly sensitive to threat. Real or perceived danger activates a search for protection. The group does not ask who is right, it asks who can secure survival. This is why harsh rhetoric, public punishment, and uncompromising posture resonate so powerfully in times of crisis. They offer a simple answer to complex anxiety. The crowd feels relieved when someone appears willing to act without hesitation. That relief is mistaken for trust. Mass psychology also reduces responsibility. When many people move in the same direction, individual accountability fades, actions feel less personal, decisions feel less owned, cruelty becomes easier because it is distributed across the group. No one feels fully responsible for outcomes. The phrase, "everyone agrees," replaces moral reflection. This diffusion of responsibility allows behaviors that individuals might resist alone to feel acceptable collectively. Another critical element is emotional contagion. Strong emotions spread faster than careful thought. Fear, anger, and outrage travel instantly through crowds. These emotions narrow attention and simplify judgment. They divide the world into allies and enemies, order and chaos, us and them. Cruelty thrives in this binary environment because it offers decisive separation. Mercy complicates boundaries. It asks for empathy toward those defined as threats, and empathy weakens emotional unity. Empathy fractures the group's shared hostility. This is why mercy feels destabilizing in mass contexts. Crowds also crave symbols. Strong leaders, harsh punishments, and dramatic gestures function as emotional anchors. They provide focus and coherence. Cruelty, when visible, becomes a symbol of control. It reassures the crowd that someone is in charge. Mercy lacks the same visual force. It does not produce spectacle. It produces absence, absence of violence, absence of retaliation, absence of drama, and absence does not mobilize masses. Mass psychology is also shaped by insecurity. When people feel economically, politically, or culturally unstable, they seek simplicity. Cruelty simplifies. It reduces complex social problems to identifiable enemies and clear responses. Mercy demands complexity. It acknowledges context, motivation, and possibility of change. This cognitive demand feels exhausting to anxious crowds. Simplicity wins not because it is accurate, but because it is easier to absorb. History shows that crowds rarely initiate cruelty alone. They respond to cues. When authority legitimizes harshness, the crowd follows. When cruelty is framed as protection, justice, or necessity, mass approval grows rapidly. The crowd does not analyze consequences. It mirrors confidence. If the leader appears certain, the crowd feels safe. Certainty becomes contagious even when it is destructive. Another paradox of mass psychology is moral reversal. In crowds, restraint can appear suspicious. Those who hesitate may be seen as disloyal or weak. Mercy becomes suspect because it interrupts momentum. Once a collective emotional direction is established, anything that slows it feels like sabotage. This is why crowds often punish restraint more harshly than aggression. They interpret hesitation as threat to unity. Over time, this dynamic creates a dangerous feedback loop. Leaders observe that harshness produces applause. They escalate severity to maintain emotional control. The crowd grows accustomed to intensity. what once shocked becomes normal, what once required justification becomes expectation. Cruelty escalates not because people become more evil, but because emotional thresholds shift. Mass psychology explains why societies later express regret. They look back and ask how they accepted what they once tolerated. The answer is not ignorance, but immersion. In the moment, the crowd felt justified. It felt protected. It felt aligned. With distance, individual moral clarity returns, but distance always comes too late. Mercy struggles in mass psychology because it speaks to individuals, not to crowds. It requires reflection, not reaction. It operates through patience, not spectacle, and crowds rarely reward patience, they reward momentum. This is why cruelty appears powerful in collective settings. It mobilizes emotion. It simplifies identity. It reinforces belonging. Mercy, by contrast, asks the crowd to slow down, to feel uncertainty, to accept risk, and uncertainty is the one thing mass psychology resists most. Understanding this does not excuse cruelty. It explains its appeal. It reveals that cruelty's power is not moral or strategic, but psychological. It thrives on fear, anonymity, and emotional alignment. And it fades when individuals regain agency and reflection. Mass psychology shows us a hard truth: cruelty feels strong when people stop thinking alone and start feeling together. Mercy feels risky because it interrupts that shared feeling and returns responsibility to the individual, and responsibility is always heavier than fear. Mercy is stronger in the long term because it builds what fear can never sustain: legitimacy. Trust cannot be forced, obedience can. Fear creates compliance quickly, but compliance is not commitment. It is a temporary adjustment to avoid punishment. Mercy, however, creates voluntary alignment. People cooperate not because they must, but because they choose to. And systems built on choice outlast systems built on coercion. Fear is efficient, but fragile. It depends on constant reinforcement. Punishment must remain visible, threat must remain believable. The moment fear weakens, control weakens with it. Mercy operates differently. It invests in relationships rather than reactions. It creates memory of fairness rather than memory of terror. Fairness generates loyalty, loyalty generates resilience, and resilience allows a system to survive pressure without collapsing. Another reason mercy is stronger over time is that it preserves feedback. In fear-based systems, people hide problems. They conceal mistakes, they avoid reporting bad news. Truth becomes dangerous, and when truth disappears, adaptation becomes impossible. Mercy creates psychological safety. Psychological safety allows honesty, honesty allows correction, correction prevents collapse. A system that can admit mistakes survives longer than one that punishes them. Mercy also reduces internal resistance. Cruelty suppresses opposition, but suppression stores energy. Resentment accumulates beneath the surface. When opportunity appears, it erupts. Mercy diffuses that energy. It lowers hostility. It reduces the desire for revenge. People who feel seen are less likely to destabilize the structure that recognizes them. This does not eliminate conflict, but it transforms it into dialogue rather than rebellion. Economically and socially, mercy encourages participation. When individuals feel secure, they innovate, they collaborate, they invest in the future. Fear restricts imagination. It narrows focus to survival. A society driven by fear produces obedience. A society shaped by trust produces contribution. Over time, contribution generates strength far beyond what intimidation can achieve. There is also a moral dimension that becomes strategic. Legitimacy multiplies power. When people believe authority is just, they defend it voluntarily, they endure hardship with it, they correct it from within rather than destroy it from without. Cruelty may hold territory, mercy holds belief. And belief sustains systems longer than fear ever can. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. Empires that relied solely on terror expanded quickly but fragmented under strain. Systems that balanced authority with fairness created deeper stability. They built alliances instead of enemies. They generated loyalty instead of silence. Their strength was slower to appear, but harder to break. Mercy is not softness. It is controlled power. It requires confidence, discipline, and patience. It resists the instinct for immediate dominance in favor of lasting cohesion. It accepts short-term vulnerability to secure long-term durability. That trade-off is what makes it powerful. Cruelty looks strong because it acts loudly. Mercy is strong because it endures quietly. cruelty demands submission, mercy earns trust, and trust is the only form of power that survives without constant force. In the end, long-term strength is not measured by how effectively a system punishes, but by how effectively it sustains cooperation once punishment is absent. Mercy succeeds where fear eventually fails, because it transforms power from domination into legitimacy, and legitimacy is the deepest foundation any system can have. Fear has always been one of the most efficient tools of power because it produces immediate order. When fear enters a system, questions disappear, hesitation collapses, choice narrows into obedience. The human brain under threat prioritizes safety over truth and submission over evaluation. This is not a moral failure. It is a neurological response. Fear activates survival circuitry. It shuts down complex reasoning and redirects energy toward compliance. That redirection is what makes fear feel like control. In political and social systems, this mechanism is extraordinarily effective. When punishment is visible and unpredictable, people adjust behavior rapidly. They do not wait to understand, they act to avoid harm. This creates the appearance of stability. Crime drops, dissent quiets, resistance retreats underground. From the outside, the system looks orderly. From the inside, it feels tense but manageable. And that manageability is mistaken for strength. Power that instills fear appears efficient because it compresses time. It achieves results without negotiation, without explanation, and without consent. The speed of compliance convinces observers that control is absolute. Fear simplifies the world. It reduces moral complexity into binary choices: obey or suffer, belong or be excluded, stay silent or be punished. This reduction is psychologically comforting in uncertain environments. Uncertainty is mentally exhausting. Fear replaces uncertainty with clarity. The rules may be brutal, but they are clear, and clarity lowers anxiety. This is why populations under threat often accept harsh authority. The authority provides predictable danger instead of unpredictable chaos. People choose known fear over unknown risk. This dynamic explains why cruelty is often interpreted as decisiveness. Harsh action demonstrates willingness to inflict cost. Willingness to inflict cost signals dominance. Dominance signals control. Control signals safety, even when that safety is illusory. The system does not need to be just. It only needs to appear capable of enforcing consequences. Once fear is established, control becomes self-sustaining. People internalize limits, they censor themselves, they anticipate punishment before it occurs. This anticipation is more powerful than punishment itself. The empire no longer needs to act constantly, fear does the work in advance. Historically, this mechanism appears repeatedly. Empires maintain order not through constant violence, but through remembered violence, public executions, exile, confiscation, imprisonment. These acts are not about the individual punished, they are messages to everyone else. The message is simple: this can happen to you. Once that message is absorbed, obedience becomes rational. Fear transforms compliance into self-protection. However, this form of control is fragile. It depends on sustained intimidation. Fear must be renewed or remembered. It cannot generate genuine loyalty, only avoidance. People obey not because they believe, but because they calculate. This calculation erodes trust and creativity. In fear-based systems, initiative disappears, innovation stalls. People do not ask what is possible, they ask what is permitted. The system becomes rigid, because flexibility requires safety. Fear also distorts perception at the top. Leaders surrounded by obedience mistake silence for agreement. They assume compliance equals support. But fear suppresses feedback. Problems go unreported until they are unmanageable. Bad news travels slowly or not at all. The system feels controlled while reality destabilizes underneath. This is the central illusion. Fear creates short-term order at the cost of long-term awareness. Another paradox emerges: fear centralizes power, but it also isolates it. The more a system relies on fear, the less it understands the people it governs. Citizens become objects of management rather than partners in stability. The state watches behavior instead of listening to voices. Control increases while legitimacy declines. The empire grows stronger in appearance and weaker in substance. Fear-based control also escalates over time. What once frightened no longer does. The system must intensify measures to maintain the same effect. Punishments grow harsher, surveillance grows broader, language grows more threatening. This escalation signals insecurity, but it is often interpreted as strength. Observers confuse intensity with authority, they mistake repression for resolve. Mercy interrupts this cycle. Mercy reduces fear, fear reduction weakens control, visibility of mercy creates uncertainty about consequences, and uncertainty threatens dominance. This is why mercy is seen as dangerous in fear-based systems. It loosens the grip. It introduces unpredictability not from violence, but from choice. And choice undermines control. In truth, fear does not equal strength. It equals leverage. Leverage requires constant pressure. Strength, by contrast, can release pressure without collapse. Empires that rely on fear confuse leverage with resilience. They maintain order by tightening grip rather than strengthening foundation. This works until the grip exhausts itself or breaks entirely. Fear equals control only in the narrowest sense. It controls behavior, but not belief. It commands obedience, but not commitment. It silences, but it does not convince, and systems that depend on silence eventually lose the ability to correct themselves. When fear becomes the primary mechanism of order, collapse does not come from rebellion alone. It comes from internal decay, from the inability to adapt once fear stops working. The tragedy is that fear feels powerful precisely when it is most corrosive. It creates an illusion of mastery while hollowing the structure it sustains. Empires that mistake fear for strength do not fall because fear disappears, they fall because fear succeeds too well, until nothing else remains. Philosophical deep layer. Cruelty is visible, mercy is invisible. This simple contrast explains why cruelty is so often mistaken for strength. Cruelty announces itself. It produces sound, impact, and spectacle. It interrupts space and demands attention. Mercy does none of this. Mercy works in absence. In the absence of violence. In the absence of retaliation. In the absence of fear. Human perception is biased toward presence. We notice what happens, not what is prevented. This bias shapes moral judgment and political intuition. Cruelty feels real because it leaves marks, mercy feels abstract because its success leaves nothing to point at. Cruelty is loud power. It speaks through force, threat, and consequence. It does not require interpretation. When cruelty is exercised, its message is immediate and unambiguous. This clarity is comforting in uncertain environments. It reduces complexity into action. It answers anxiety with certainty. Mercy, by contrast, is quiet power. It does not impose meaning, it allows it to emerge. Mercy requires time to be understood. It depends on future behavior, future trust, future restraint, and the future is always uncertain. Uncertainty makes people uneasy. This unease is often misread as weakness. Philosophically, cruelty aligns with the logic of domination. It treats power as the ability to impose will upon others. The more visible the imposition, the stronger the power appears. This view of power is external. It measures strength by outcomes that can be observed, recorded, and feared. Mercy challenges this definition. It locates power internally. In the capacity to restrain, to choose not to act when action is available. This restraint does not create spectacle. It creates stability, but stability without spectacle rarely feels powerful in moments of crisis. Cruelty simplifies moral space. It divides the world into controller and controlled, authority and subject, order and disorder. These divisions are cognitively efficient, they reduce ambiguity. Mercy complicates moral space. It introduces context, motivation, and possibility. It refuses simple binaries, and complexity is mentally demanding. Thus cruelty feels decisive while mercy feels hesitant, even when mercy is the result of deliberate choice rather than uncertainty. Another philosophical dimension lies in temporality. Cruelty operates in the present moment. It produces immediate effect, mercy operates across time. Its strength is cumulative rather than instantaneous. What cruelty achieves now, mercy builds slowly. Human attention is drawn to the now. We privilege immediacy over endurance. This temporal bias causes us to overvalue short-term dominance and undervalue long-term cohesion. Cruelty benefits from this bias, mercy suffers from it. There is also an ontological difference. Cruelty treats human beings as means, objects to be managed, disciplined, or eliminated. Mercy treats human beings as ends. Entities capable of change, this recognition is philosophically demanding that it denies the simplicity of control, that it insists on the unpredictability of freedom, and freedom is unsettling to power. Power prefers compliance because compliance is measurable, mercy accepts freedom, and with it, the risk of disappointment. Cruelty also externalizes fear, that it projects anxiety outward by creating enemies and enforcing boundaries. Mercy internalizes fear. It requires the one who holds power to confront uncertainty within themselves. To tolerate the possibility of betrayal or failure. This inward confrontation is invisible but profound, that it does not display dominance, that it demonstrates mastery of self rather than mastery of others. Societies rarely celebrate this kind of mastery because it lacks spectacle. The invisibility of mercy also affects historical memory. History records battles, executions, and conquests. It rarely records reconciliations that prevented conflict. It remembers the collapse that occurred, not the war that never happened. As a result, cruelty dominates historical narratives while mercy remains underrepresented. This narrative imbalance reinforces the illusion that cruelty is more effective, when in reality it is simply more visible. Ultimately, the philosophical error lies in confusing force with strength. Force compels, strength sustains, cruelty compels behavior. Mercy sustains relationships. One operates through fear, the other through legitimacy. Fear demands constant reinforcement, legitimacy renews itself through trust. Cruelty looks powerful because it is noisy, mercy is powerful because it is durable. Cruelty commands attention, mercy earns belief, and belief outlives fear. The deepest philosophical truth is this: power that must always be seen is already insecure, power that can remain unseen has learned to endure. Across history, the association between cruelty and strength did not emerge randomly. It was refined, systematized, and perfected by empires that understood one brutal truth: fear communicates faster than trust. Rome, the Mongol Empire, and modern totalitarian regimes each mastered this language in different eras, using cruelty not as chaos, but as strategy. In all three cases, violence was not merely punishment, it was messaging. Rome understood cruelty as governance. The Roman state did not rely on constant terror, but on carefully staged brutality. Public executions, crucifixions, and gladiatorial games were not spontaneous acts of violence, they were deliberate spectacles designed to teach lessons. The crucifixion of rebels along roads was not meant to kill efficiently. It was meant to be seen. The message was unmistakable: this is the cost of defiance. Fear reduced uncertainty. People did not need to guess what would happen if they resisted, they already knew. This clarity created compliance. Rome could rule vast territories not because it was omnipresent, but because its reputation was. Cruelty traveled faster than legions, and because punishment was public, obedience became internalized. People governed themselves to avoid becoming examples, but this same mechanism blinded Rome over time. The more it relied on intimidation, the less it understood loyalty. Silence replaced feedback. The empire mistook fear-induced order for legitimacy. And when fear weakened, there was nothing underneath it to hold the structure together. The Mongol Empire elevated cruelty into psychological warfare. Unlike Rome, which used ritualized punishment to stabilize internal order, the Mongols used extreme violence to eliminate resistance before it formed. They destroyed entire cities not because it was always necessary, but because it was efficient. A single massacre could spare dozens of future battles. Once the reputation was established, many cities surrendered without a fight. This was terror as optimization. The Mongols understood that cruelty, when concentrated and unpredictable, could paralyze opposition. The fear they generated preceded them. Cities did not calculate military odds, they calculated survival. The paradox is that Mongol cruelty was often selective. Once submission occurred, order could be relatively tolerant, but mercy came only after terror did its work. This reinforced the lesson. Mercy is not a right, it is a reward, and rewards controlled by power increase obedience more than violence alone. However, this system depended entirely on maintaining the aura of unstoppable force. The moment that aura fractured, the empire fragmented rapidly. Fear unified quickly, but it did not bind deeply. Modern totalitarian regimes refined cruelty even further. They internalized fear. The goal was no longer only public punishment, but psychological occupation. These systems learned that constant visible violence was inefficient. Instead, they cultivated uncertainty. arbitrary arrests, unpredictable enforcement, and shifting rules created an environment where people could never feel safe. Every citizen became a potential suspect, every thought carried risk. This form of cruelty did not rely on spectacle alone, that it relied on anticipation. People disciplined themselves more effectively than any police force could. Fear became internal governance. Totalitarian power did not need to be everywhere, it needed to be possible everywhere. This omnipresent threat collapsed individuality and erased trust. People learned not only to obey, but to think cautiously, to speak carefully, to doubt even their own perceptions. The regime appeared strong because resistance vanished, but what disappeared was not dissent, it was visibility. In all three cases, cruelty functioned as a shortcut to order. It bypassed persuasion, consensus, and legitimacy. It created immediate compliance and simplified control, but the cost was always the same. Cruelty destroyed feedback. When people are afraid, they do not tell the truth, they tell what keeps them safe. This creates a fatal asymmetry. Power believes it is informed because reports continue to arrive, but those reports are curated by fear. The system loses its ability to perceive reality accurately. And a system that cannot see cannot adapt. Rome did not fall when it lost battles. It fell when it lost legitimacy and awareness. The Mongol Empire did not collapse because of rebellion alone. It collapsed because its cohesion depended on perpetual dominance. Totalitarian regimes do not end because fear disappears, they end because fear hollows out society until nothing remains capable of sustaining power once control weakens. These examples reveal the same illusion. Cruelty looks like strength because it works fast. It commands bodies. It stills crowds. It produces visible order. But strength measured by silence is deceptive. Silence can mean consent, or terror. Empires that confuse the two mistake suppression for stability. History does not deny that cruelty can build empires. It shows that cruelty cannot sustain them indefinitely. It creates obedience without trust, order without legitimacy, and control without resilience. When fear finally stops working, whether through exhaustion, exposure, or change, the collapse feels sudden, but it is not sudden at all. It is the delayed consequence of a system that chose domination over durability. Cruelty speaks loudly, mercy speaks slowly. History remembers the loud voices first, but it is the slow forces that determine what survives. Mercy is seen as risk because it weakens the most immediate tool of control, certainty. Power systems rely on predictability, clear rules, clear consequences, clear hierarchy. When punishment is harsh, everyone understands the boundaries. They may fear them, but they recognize them. Mercy disrupts that clarity. It introduces uncertainty. What happens now? Will this person change? Will others test the limits? Uncertainty creates anxiety, and anxiety makes systems defensive. From a psychological standpoint, mercy requires trust. Trust has no guarantee. It assumes that the forgiven person will not exploit the second chance. It assumes growth, reflection, or reciprocity. None of these outcomes can be controlled. Power structures, especially in unstable environments, prefer outcomes that can be measured immediately. Punishment delivers instant results. Mercy delivers possibility, and possibility feels fragile compared to certainty. Mercy also shifts responsibility. When a leader punishes, the system appears strong and decisive. If something goes wrong later, the blame remains with the punished. But when a leader forgives, the risk concentrates at the top. If the forgiven person fails again, the mercy itself is questioned. This makes forgiveness politically dangerous. Cruelty spreads responsibility outward, mercy absorbs it inward. There is also an evolutionary dimension. For most of human history, sparing a threat could mean destruction. Aggression eliminated danger quickly, restraint required long-term thinking and group coordination. Traits that are slower and more cognitively demanding. Under stress, the human brain defaults to survival instincts. It prefers eliminating risk rather than negotiating with it. Mercy therefore feels unnatural in moments of fear. It appears as vulnerability rather than strength. Culturally, mercy is misunderstood because its success is invisible. Punishment creates spectacle. It is seen, remembered, and discussed. Mercy prevents harm quietly. The violence that never happens, the revenge that never escalates, the trust that slowly builds. These are difficult to measure. Human perception is drawn to dramatic action, not to restrained action. As a result, mercy appears passive even when it is transformative. Mercy also softens hierarchy. punishment reinforces vertical power. It reminds everyone who decides and who obeys. Mercy reduces psychological distance. It acknowledges the humanity of the other. This humanization weakens the aura of absolute authority. Systems built on dominance perceive this as threat, because once authority becomes human, it becomes negotiable, and negotiability feels like instability. Yet the paradox is clear: mercy is risky only in the short term. It risks being misunderstood. It risks temporary disorder. It risks criticism. But cruelty carries deeper, long-term risks. It destroys trust. It silences feedback. It creates resentment that eventually destabilizes the system. Mercy gambles on transformation, cruelty guarantees fear. True strength is not the absence of risk, but the capacity to withstand it. Mercy requires internal confidence. It demands the ability to act without relying on intimidation. It is not weakness. It is disciplined power. Cruelty reacts, mercy chooses. That choice is what makes mercy appear dangerous in systems that depend on fear. In the end, mercy is seen as risk because it replaces control with legitimacy. It shifts power from domination to consent, and any system built primarily on fear will experience that shift not as growth, but as threat. Throughout history, one pattern repeats with unsettling consistency: cruel leaders rise quickly, they command attention, they silence opposition, they project certainty in moments of chaos, and societies, especially in times of fear, often interpret this projection as strength. Cruelty appears decisive. It appears clear. It appears powerful. Mercy, by contrast, appears uncertain, soft, deliberate, slow. And in unstable environments, slowness feels dangerous. This psychological contrast is not accidental. It is deeply rooted in human perception. When people feel threatened, they instinctively search for signals of control. A raised voice, a harsh punishment, a public display of force. These signals reduce ambiguity. They tell the brain that someone is in charge, even if the cost is high. The clarity itself feels stabilizing. Mercy does not provide that clarity. It introduces complexity. It requires trust. It allows space for unpredictability, and unpredictability triggers anxiety. The human nervous system evolved in environments where immediate threats required immediate responses. Swift aggression could deter danger, hesitation could invite it. Over centuries, this survival logic embedded itself into social behavior. What began as a survival instinct gradually transformed into a political aesthetic. Cruelty became associated with authority because it compresses decision-making into visible action. It transforms uncertainty into command. Mercy does the opposite. It expands the field of possibility. It opens dialogue. It assumes change is possible rather than impossible, and that assumption carries risk. The paradox is striking: cruelty is often impulsive, yet it is perceived as controlled. Mercy is often deliberate, yet it is perceived as weak. This inversion reveals something profound about power itself. Power is not only about outcomes. It is about perception, and perception is shaped by emotion before it is shaped by reason. When people witness force, they feel certainty. When they witness restraint, they feel doubt. Certainty calms, doubt disturbs. Therefore cruelty feels stabilizing even when it destroys long-term trust. This pattern appears across civilizations. Empires have frequently relied on fear to consolidate control because fear produces immediate compliance. The spectacle of punishment, the public assertion of dominance, the uncompromising decree, all create visible hierarchy. Visibility matters. People obey what they can see and measure. Mercy, however, operates invisibly. It builds legitimacy slowly through trust and reciprocity, but trust cannot be displayed as dramatically as punishment. It grows quietly, and quiet growth rarely feels powerful in moments of crisis. As a result, societies repeatedly misinterpret the signals of strength. They equate harshness with capability and equanimity with fragility. They assume that the one who punishes fastest is the one who governs best. They overlook the long-term consequences because short-term stability feels more urgent. The tragedy of this dynamic is not merely historical. It is psychological. Cruelty satisfies the human desire for immediate order. Mercy demands tolerance for uncertainty, and uncertainty feels like vulnerability. In environments shaped by competition, conflict, and insecurity, vulnerability is easily mistaken for weakness. This misunderstanding has shaped leadership structures, military traditions, and political systems for centuries. It explains why aggressive rhetoric often wins applause while nuanced dialogue struggles for attention. It explains why the loudest voice in the room can feel like the strongest even when it lacks wisdom. The deeper question, however, is whether this perception is accurate. Is cruelty truly strength, or is it fear disguised as control? Is mercy truly weakness, or is it courage that operates without spectacle? To answer these questions, we must examine not only history, but the architecture of human psychology. We must understand why the display of force calms collective anxiety while the display of compassion unsettles it. We must explore how fear can create obedience without loyalty, and how restraint can build legitimacy without intimidation. This inquiry is not about morality alone. It is about survival, authority, and the patterns that shape civilizations. If cruelty consistently appears powerful, it is because it aligns with our instinctive responses to threat. If mercy appears risky, it is because it challenges those instincts and asks for patience rather than panic. The central tension of history may not be between good and evil, but between immediate control and long-term stability. Cruelty promises control, mercy invests in stability. And throughout history, societies have repeatedly chosen the promise over the investment. This is the foundation of the paradox we are about to explore. Why mercy is seen as risk. Mercy is perceived as risk not because it is weak, but because it removes certainty. Power systems survive on predictability. They need clear expectations, clear consequences, and clear hierarchies. Mercy disrupts all three. When a system punishes harshly, people know the rules. They may hate them, but they understand them. Mercy introduces ambiguity. It forces everyone to ask a dangerous question: what happens now? That uncertainty is deeply unsettling for both rulers and the ruled, because uncertainty reopens choice, and choice undermines control. From a psychological perspective, mercy requires trust. Trust is expensive. It assumes that the other side will not exploit restraint. It assumes learning, change, or reciprocity, and none of these can be guaranteed. In fear-based systems, guarantees matter more than outcomes. A harsh punishment guarantees compliance today. Mercy only promises a possibility tomorrow. Power that relies on immediate results cannot afford possibilities. It needs certainty, even if that certainty is brutal. This is why mercy feels irresponsible to systems obsessed with stability. It introduces variables that cannot be controlled. Mercy also shifts responsibility inward. When a leader punishes, the system remains external. The fault belongs to the punished. When a leader forgives, the system absorbs risk. If things go wrong, the blame returns to the one who showed mercy. This asymmetry makes mercy politically dangerous. Cruelty distributes responsibility downward, mercy concentrates responsibility upward, and systems that already fear accountability naturally avoid choices that increase it. There is also a deep evolutionary component. Mercy violates ancient threat response logic. For most of human history, sparing a threat could mean extinction. Aggression eliminated danger quickly, restraint required long-term thinking and collective coordination. Skills that evolve later and remain fragile under stress. When societies experience instability, they regress toward older instincts. They prefer elimination over rehabilitation, certainty over patience. In this context, mercy triggers an unconscious alarm. It feels like letting danger survive. Culturally, mercy is also misread because its effects are invisible. Punishment produces spectacle, mercy produces absence. Absence of violence, absence of fear, absence of immediate drama. Human attention is drawn to events, not to non-events. We notice executions. We do not notice the crimes that never happened because trust was built. This perceptual bias makes mercy seem ineffective, even when it works. Mercy's success is quiet, and quiet rarely looks powerful. Another reason mercy is seen as risk is that it undermines hierarchy. Punishment reinforces vertical order. It reminds everyone who decides and who obeys. Mercy flattens distance. It acknowledges humanity in the other. This acknowledgement weakens the psychological gap that authority depends on. Power systems fear this erosion because hierarchy simplifies governance. Once people are seen as redeemable rather than disposable, the moral logic of domination weakens. Mercy humanizes, and humanization complicates control. Mercy also exposes the system's own fragility. A ruler who shows mercy implicitly admits that force is not the only option. This admission suggests that power is not absolute, but conditional. Power built on fear cannot tolerate this implication that it must appear inevitable, not chosen. Mercy reveals choice, and choice implies that alternatives exist. That is why mercy is often framed as naive, soft, or dangerous, not because it fails, but because it reveals that cruelty was never the only path. Historically, mercy has always been most controversial in moments of crisis. In stable periods, it is praised as virtue. In unstable periods, it is condemned as weakness. This tells us something important. The problem is not mercy itself, but timing. When systems feel secure, they can afford generosity. When they feel threatened, they retreat into punishment. The judgment of mercy says more about the system's fear than about mercy's value. In reality, mercy is risky only in the short term. It risks being exploited. It risks appearing weak. It risks delayed consequences. But cruelty carries deeper, long-term risks. It destroys trust. It eliminates feedback. It radicalizes opposition. It creates silence instead of loyalty. Mercy risks betrayal. Cruelty guarantees resentment. The difference is temporal. Mercy gambles on the future. Cruelty mortgages it. True strength is not the absence of risk. It is the capacity to absorb it. Power that cannot tolerate uncertainty is brittle. It must constantly reinforce itself through fear. Mercy, by contrast, requires internal confidence. It demands the ability to withstand temporary vulnerability without collapsing. It is not weakness. It is delayed strength. Mercy feels like risk because it does not protect power immediately. It protects legitimacy over time. And history consistently shows that systems survive not on fear alone, but on the willingness of people to cooperate even when fear is absent. That cooperation cannot be coerced. It must be earned, and earning it always begins with restraint. The final irony is this: mercy is risky only in systems that are already insecure. Confident power can afford mercy because it does not fear being questioned. Insecure power cannot, because mercy reveals its dependence on fear. When mercy is labeled weakness, it is usually because fear has become the true foundation of control. So mercy is not dangerous because it fails. Mercy is dangerous because it works differently. It shifts power from domination to legitimacy, from immediacy to endurance, from control to consent. And systems built on fear experience that shift not as evolution, but as threat. Long before empires, long before laws, long before philosophy, human behavior was shaped by survival. In small tribes exposed to predators, scarcity, and rival groups, the cost of hesitation could mean extinction. In such environments, aggression was not cruelty. It was protection. Decisiveness was not tyranny. It was defense. The individuals who reacted quickly to threat, who punished betrayal harshly, and who projected dominance often increased the group's immediate chances of survival. Over generations, this survival logic left psychological residue. What once helped small bands endure dangerous landscapes gradually became embedded in collective instincts. This is the shadow of natural selection. It does not disappear when societies become more complex. It adapts. In early human communities, mercy carried risk. Sharing limited resources with outsiders could weaken the tribe. Sparing an enemy could invite retaliation. Tolerating dissent during crisis could fracture cohesion. Harsh punishment, by contrast, created clear boundaries. Clear boundaries reduce uncertainty. Uncertainty is metabolically expensive for the brain. It demands analysis, deliberation, and trust, but in high-risk environments, trust could be exploited. Aggression simplified decision-making. It eliminated ambiguity. The group survived not because it was compassionate, but because it was cohesive, and cohesion was often enforced through dominance. Over thousands of years, this logic shaped leadership expectations. A leader who appeared strong, physically assertive, uncompromising, capable of swift punishment, signaled protection to the group. Protection reduced anxiety. Reduced anxiety increased cooperation. This does not mean cruelty was morally justified. It means cruelty was psychologically legible. It sent a signal the brain could decode instantly. Power is present, threat is controlled. Mercy did not produce the same signal. Mercy required interpretation. It required assessing intentions, probabilities, and future outcomes. That cognitive load made it slower and more fragile in perception. As societies expanded beyond tribal structures, the conditions changed, but the instincts remained. Cities replaced camps, empires replaced clans, laws replaced brute retaliation, yet the ancient wiring persisted. When collective fear rises, during war, economic collapse, or cultural uncertainty, societies regress toward survival logic. They seek visible dominance, they seek decisive action, they gravitate toward leaders who project certainty rather than nuance. This is not because people consciously reject compassion. It is because under stress, the brain defaults to what once ensured survival. Natural selection rewarded rapid response to threat, not moral reflection. It prioritized safety over fairness and cohesion over complexity. The modern world, however, requires something different. It demands negotiation, delayed gratification, and cooperation across differences. These traits evolve later and more slowly. They are fragile compared to primal instincts. A single shock can awaken the older circuitry. The language of protection and punishment becomes louder. The appetite for strong displays of force returns. This is why cruelty often resurfaces in times of instability. It resonates with ancestral memory. But the shadow of natural selection is incomplete if misunderstood. Aggression ensured survival in small, short-term contexts. It did not ensure flourishing in large, interdependent systems. As human networks grew, cooperation and trust became more advantageous than dominance alone. Tribes that could trade, coordinate, and build alliances outlasted those that relied solely on fear. The problem is timing. Aggression produces immediate compliance. Cooperation produces delayed resilience. Our perception mistakes immediacy for strength and delay for weakness. This misreading persists because our evolutionary psychology privileges short-term survival cues over long-term stability indicators. In this shadow, we see the root of the paradox. Cruelty appears powerful because it activates ancient survival signals. Mercy appears risky because it suppresses them. To show mercy is to override instinct. It requires confidence that the environment can tolerate vulnerability. It requires belief that trust will not be exploited. This belief is cognitively demanding and emotionally exposed. Aggression demands less reflection. It feels simpler, clearer, and therefore stronger. Understanding this evolutionary backdrop does not justify cruelty. It explains why it feels persuasive. It reveals why societies repeatedly gravitate toward harshness under pressure and why compassion is often misread as naivety. The shadow of natural selection still influences modern judgment. It shapes how authority is perceived and how strength is interpreted, but evolution is not destiny. The same species that evolved aggression also evolved empathy, cooperation, and moral reasoning. The tension between cruelty and mercy is not a battle between weakness and strength. It is a conflict between two evolutionary strategies, one optimized for immediate threat, another for long-term coexistence. Empires that operate solely within the older strategy may dominate quickly, but they struggle to sustain legitimacy. Empires that learn to integrate restraint with authority move beyond survival into stability. The shadow remains, but awareness changes how it governs us. The real question is not whether cruelty once aided survival. It is whether we continue to mistake ancestral reflexes for modern wisdom. As empires mature, they increasingly replace lived experience with numbers. What once required listening now requires counting. This shift feels rational, modern, and objective, but it carries a hidden cost. Statistics compress reality. They turn complex human conditions into clean abstractions. Trends replace stories, averages replace suffering, percentages replace fear. From the center, this looks like clarity. From the edges, it feels like erasure. The empire begins to believe it understands society because it can measure it, but measurement is not understanding. Data describes outcomes, not causes. It captures what has already happened, not what is about to break. As reliance on statistics grows, decision-makers become insulated from direct feedback. They no longer hear voices. They read reports. Problems arrive as charts, not cries. This distance dulls urgency. When pain is reduced to a number, it becomes negotiable. A decline of 10% can be postponed. A rise in unrest can be reframed as manageable. Statistics invite delay because they appear controllable, but reality is not. Linear models fail where human behavior shifts suddenly. Empires trust numbers because numbers feel neutral. They do not accuse. They do not demand moral response. They allow leaders to appear informed without being affected. This creates a dangerous illusion that the system is still readable, when in fact, the most important changes are qualitative. They happen in trust, fear, hope, and resentment, dimensions that resist measurement. By the time these forces surface statistically, they have already matured socially. The empire reacts to graphs while the ground has already moved beneath it. This is why late-stage empires often feel surprised by collapse. Every indicator looked stable, until it wasn't. The failure was not lack of data, but excess of it. Data replaced judgment. And judgment cannot be automated. Empires that mistake metrics for reality slowly lose contact with the lives they govern. They become efficient at managing symbols of stability while missing the substance. When numbers become more trusted than people, truth becomes abstract, and abstract truth arrives too late to prevent real collapse. Why empires die while looking backward? Empires rarely face the future directly. They turn their gaze backward, and in doing so, they slowly lose the ability to move forward. The past becomes a shelter, a source of reassurance, and eventually a substitute for strategy. When an empire begins to weaken, it does not immediately question its direction. It questions its confidence, and instead of rebuilding that confidence through adaptation, it borrows it from memory. Golden ages are revived, celebrated, and ritualized, not to learn from them, but to hide behind them. The past is safer than the future because it no longer demands decisions. It cannot resist. It cannot contradict. It can only be interpreted, and interpretation is power. This is why declining empires obsess over their former greatness. They repeat stories of victories, heroes, and moral superiority as proof that they still deserve endurance. But memory, when used this way, becomes anesthesia. It dulls the discomfort of present failure. The empire reassures itself not by asking what must change, but by reminding itself of what once worked. This creates a fatal misalignment. Problems are modern, but solutions are ancient. Challenges evolve, but responses remain symbolic. The system keeps applying yesterday's answers to today's questions, because admitting novelty would require admitting unpreparedness. Nostalgia becomes policy. The past is no longer a reference point, it becomes an argument. If something worked before, it must work again. This belief feels logical, but history punishes it relentlessly. Context is ignored, circumstances are flattened, time is treated as repetition rather than movement. The empire forgets that its former strength was once an adaptation, not a tradition. By freezing that adaptation into identity, it kills the very flexibility that created it. Past glory also silences critique. Any call for change can be dismissed as disrespect. Any warning can be framed as betrayal of heritage. The empire defends memory instead of reality. It confuses loyalty to history with loyalty to survival, and while it is busy preserving symbols, the world moves on, new powers adapt, new systems experiment. The empire remains faithful to a version of itself that no longer exists. This is why decline often feels dignified from the inside. Rituals continue, monuments stand, language remains confident, the illusion of continuity persists. But continuity without relevance is decay in slow motion. Empires do not die because they forget their past, they die because they mistake remembrance for strategy. They look backward not to understand, but to avoid the terror of uncertainty, and by the time they finally turn their eyes forward, they discover they are already standing in ruins that once felt like heritage. Empires rarely fail because they lack information. They fail because information arrives into a system that is no longer capable of acting on it. In the early stages of power, signals matter. Small changes trigger response because survival depends on sensitivity. But as empires stabilize, they exchange sensitivity for control. They become structured around preserving order, not interpreting change. This shift quietly rewires how decisions are made. The system stops reacting to reality and starts reacting to itself. Speed is replaced by procedure, curiosity is replaced by protocol, and by the time action is approved, the moment that required action has already passed. Delay becomes the default response, not because leaders are unaware, but because acting early is politically expensive. Early action admits vulnerability. It suggests that the system misjudged something, and mature empires cannot tolerate the implication that they might be wrong. The safest move becomes waiting. Waiting appears reasonable. It allows time for uncertainty to resolve itself. It protects authority from embarrassment. It preserves continuity. But history shows that waiting is rarely neutral. It favors decay. The longer a system waits, the more adjustment replaces correction. Small problems grow while they are being studied. Costs rise while committees debate. Empires do not ignore danger, they schedule it. They push decisions forward until the threat either disappears on its own or becomes undeniable. and when it becomes undeniable, it is usually irreversible. This pattern is reinforced by hierarchy. Bad news slows as it moves upward, each layer hesitates to be the messenger that triggers disruption. As a result, leaders receive warnings only when they are already severe. What reaches the center is not the beginning of a crisis, but its late stage. Reaction at that point feels sudden and extreme, even though the cause has been developing for years. Empires also suffer from success bias. What worked in the past becomes the template for every future problem. Policies are reused long after conditions have changed. Because they once succeeded, they feel safe, but past solutions applied to new realities produce failure with confidence. The system keeps acting as if time has paused, while the world continues to move. This creates a widening gap between perception and reality. Reaction always trails change, never leads it. By the time the empire mobilizes, it is responding to yesterday's world with yesterday's tools. This is why imperial reactions feel dramatic but ineffective. They come not from foresight, but from panic, and panic is the opposite of strategy. Empires do not react late because they are slow. They react late because they are designed to protect stability first and survival only second. By the time stability is threatened enough to justify action, survival has already been compromised. Why justice disappears as laws multiply. At first glance, laws appear to be the guardians of justice. The more rules a society creates, the safer and fairer it seems. But history reveals a paradox. When laws multiply excessively, justice often fades. This happens not because justice is rejected, but because it is slowly replaced by procedure. In early societies, law exists to protect moral balance. It is flexible, interpreted through context, and guided by judgment. As systems grow larger and more complex, law shifts from meaning to management. Rules expand to cover every possibility, not to ensure fairness, but to eliminate uncertainty. What cannot be predicted cannot be controlled. So the system responds by writing more laws. Each new rule promises clarity, but together they create distance. The human element, context, intent, and conscience, is pushed aside. Legal obedience becomes more important than moral outcome. In such environments, justice is no longer something to be sought. It is something to be processed. People learn to follow rules correctly rather than act rightly. The question changes from, is this fair, to, is this allowed? This shift is subtle, but devastating. It trains individuals to outsource ethical responsibility to the system. If the rule was followed, the conscience is clean, even when the result is cruel. This is how injustice becomes legal. Empires nearing decline rely heavily on law because law creates the illusion of order while avoiding the risk of judgment. True justice requires interpretation, and interpretation requires courage. It forces authorities to admit complexity and accept responsibility. Laws remove that burden. They distribute responsibility so widely that no one feels accountable. As procedures grow thicker, decisions slow, paperwork replaces empathy, process replaces presence. The system becomes efficient at protecting itself, but blind to the human cost. Those harmed by legal outcomes are told not that they were wronged, but that the rules were applied correctly. This response feels final and unchallengeable. Because rules appear objective, they silence moral debate. To argue against a law is framed as disorder. To question procedure is framed as irresponsibility. This creates a society where justice is technically upheld and practically absent. History shows that the most law-saturated empires are often the least just. Late Rome, imperial bureaucracies, and modern technocracies all demonstrate this pattern. The increase of law signals not moral clarity but moral anxiety. When a system no longer trusts judgment, it builds walls of regulation. But walls do not create fairness, they create distance. And justice cannot survive distance. It lives in discretion, context, and the willingness to see people rather than cases. When law becomes the goal rather than the tool, justice does not fail dramatically. It quietly steps aside, and no one notices, because everything is technically in order. Empires do not collapse from the center outward, they unravel from the edges inward. The first cracks appear far from palaces and capitals, where reality is lived rather than administered. As power centralizes, the distance between the provinces and the center grows. Not just geographically, but psychologically. The center begins to govern through abstraction. Reports replace presence. Decrees replace understanding. What reaches the capital is no longer lived experience, but filtered summaries shaped to fit expectations. Local problems are translated into acceptable language before they travel upward. By the time they arrive, they have lost urgency, context, and emotional weight. The center believes it is informed because information is constant, but it is incomplete. This broken link creates a fatal asymmetry. The provinces feel strain long before the center senses it. They experience shortages, resentment, and instability directly, while the center sees only numbers and formal complaints. This delay produces misinterpretation. Local unrest is framed as incompetence or disloyalty rather than warning. The response is often discipline instead of diagnosis, control instead of listening. As trust erodes, communication becomes strategic rather than honest. Local officials learn that survival depends on telling the center what it wants to hear, not what it needs to know. This accelerates disconnection. The center becomes increasingly confident precisely because it hears less resistance. It mistakes silence for stability. Meanwhile, the provinces adapt in isolation. They develop parallel systems, informal networks, and quiet defiance. These adaptations are invisible to the center but crucial to survival at the edges. When collapse finally arrives, it feels sudden in the capital, but inevitable in the provinces. They have been living inside it for years. The empire falls not because the center was malicious, but because it was distant, and distance is lethal in complex systems. The moment the center can no longer feel the periphery, it has already lost the ability to govern reality. One of the most dangerous illusions empires develop is confusing survival with health. As long as the system continues to exist, it assumes it is functioning, but survival is not proof of strength. It is often proof of inertia. Empires can survive for long periods in weakened states, held together by habit, bureaucracy, and fear. This endurance creates false confidence. The system interprets still standing as still working. But history shows that many empires lived long after they stopped being effective. They survived not because they were strong, but because no alternative had yet replaced them. This delay disguises decay. Survival becomes a metric that replaces self-examination. The question is no longer, are we just, or are we adaptive, but simply, are we still here? And as long as the answer is yes, urgency disappears. This is how decline becomes invisible from the inside. Why empires fear change more than failure. Change is dangerous to empires because it exposes choice. Failure can be blamed on enemies, circumstances, or fate. Change cannot. It forces the system to admit agency. To admit that things could be different, and therefore that they were chosen not to be. This is why empires tolerate inefficiency, long-term loss, and even humiliation before they tolerate transformation. Change disrupts hierarchies. It creates uncertainty about who matters, who decides, and who benefits. Failure, by contrast, can be absorbed into existing narratives. Change threatens identity. Empires are not afraid of collapse. They are afraid of becoming something else, and that fear keeps them locked in patterns long after those patterns stop working. In the early life of a system, problems demand solutions. They threaten survival and force adaptation. But as empires mature, their relationship with problems changes. Solutions become dangerous because they disrupt balance, shift power, and create uncertainty. Management, by contrast, is safe. It contains rather than resolves. Empires learn that unresolved problems can be stabilized, measured, and controlled. At least for a time, this creates the illusion of competence without the risk of transformation. Instead of asking how to eliminate a problem, the system asks how to keep it within acceptable limits. Poverty becomes manageable inequality, corruption becomes isolated misconduct, unrest becomes a security concern rather than a social warning. Each issue is framed not as a failure of structure, but as a variable to be adjusted. This managerial mindset allows problems to persist indefinitely as long as they do not explode. The empire becomes skilled at preventing crisis, but incapable of preventing decay. Management requires procedures, committees, and metrics. These create movement without direction, activity without resolution. The system appears busy, productive, and responsive, yet nothing essential changes. This is not inefficiency. It is design. True solutions threaten existing hierarchies. They demand accountability. They redistribute power. Management preserves them. By choosing management over resolution, the empire protects itself in the short term while accumulating pressure in the long term. Problems left unresolved do not disappear, they compound, they interact, they evolve. What was once isolated becomes systemic. what was once tolerable becomes destabilizing, but because the system has invested in managing symptoms, it lacks the tools to address causes. When crisis finally overwhelms management capacity, reaction becomes abrupt and coercive. Empires that spent decades managing problems are forced to confront them all at once. Without preparation, the collapse feels sudden only because resolution was deferred for too long. In this sense, management is not neutral. It is a strategy of delay, and delay, when repeated long enough, is indistinguishable from decline. Empires do not collapse. They stop thinking. Empires are not destroyed the moment their walls fall or their armies retreat. They are destroyed much earlier, at the moment thinking becomes inconvenient, when reflection threatens stability, thought is labeled as danger, when questions slow obedience, questions are discouraged. The system does not lose intelligence overnight, it slowly trains itself not to use it. What once required judgment is handed over to habit. What once demanded courage is replaced by routine. Decisions are no longer evaluated for truth, but for consistency with what already exists. The empire keeps functioning, but only mechanically. It repeats policies, rituals, and language long after they have lost connection to reality. This is not ignorance. It is deliberate mental economy. Thinking requires admitting uncertainty. Admitting uncertainty threatens authority. So the empire chooses repetition over understanding. It stops asking why and focuses only on how to maintain order, how to preserve appearance, how to continue without disruption. In this state, collapse is no longer an external threat. It becomes an internal process already underway, because a system that no longer thinks cannot adapt, and a system that cannot adapt does not need to be defeated. It only needs time. Empires do not collapse. They stop thinking. Empires are not destroyed the moment their walls fall or their armies retreat. They are destroyed much earlier, at the moment thinking becomes inconvenient, when reflection threatens stability, thought is labeled as danger, when questions slow obedience, questions are discouraged. The system does not lose intelligence overnight, it slowly trains itself not to use it. What once required judgment is handed over to habit. What once demanded courage is replaced by routine. Decisions are no longer evaluated for truth, but for consistency with what already exists. The empire keeps functioning, but only mechanically. It repeats policies, rituals, and language long after they have lost connection to reality. This is not ignorance. It is deliberate mental economy. Thinking requires admitting uncertainty. Admitting uncertainty threatens authority. So the empire chooses repetition over understanding. It stops asking why and focuses only on how to maintain order, how to preserve appearance, how to continue without disruption. In this state, collapse is no longer an external threat. It becomes an internal process already underway, because a system that no longer thinks cannot adapt, and a system that cannot adapt does not need to be defeated. It only needs time. The lie of, "we can't change anything anyway." This sentence sounds harmless. It feels realistic, mature, even wise, but throughout history, it has been one of the most effective lie systems ever taught people to repeat. "We can't change anything anyway" is not a conclusion reached after analysis. It is a psychological surrender disguised as realism. Empires do not need citizens to believe in them. They only need citizens to stop believing in their own agency. The moment people accept that change is impossible, responsibility dissolves, action feels pointless, and silence begins to feel rational. This belief does not emerge in a vacuum. It is cultivated when individuals attempt to act and see no immediate results. Discouragement sets in when institutions are distant and unresponsive. Effort feels wasted. Over time, this repeated frustration trains people to lower expectations, not because they are incapable, but because hope becomes emotionally expensive. The lie works by shifting the focus from collective capacity to individual insignificance. Each person looks at the scale of the system and concludes that their voice is too small to matter. What they fail to see is that systems rely on this calculation being made by everyone simultaneously. If even a small portion refused this logic, the structure would wobble. But the lie isolates. Each person assumes others are passive. Each waits for a movement that never begins because everyone is waiting. This is how paralysis becomes normal. The statement also protects moral comfort. If nothing can be changed, then nothing is required. Guilt disappears, responsibility fades, the system benefits from this deeply, because power is safest when opposition feels futile rather than forbidden. A forbidden action still carries desire. A futile action carries apathy, and apathy is more reliable than fear. History shows that this lie appears most often not at the height of tyranny, but during slow decline. When conditions worsen gradually, people adapt rather than resist. They tell themselves that things have always been this way or that worse alternatives exist. The belief that change is impossible becomes a coping mechanism. It reduces anxiety by lowering ambition, but what it really does is convert structural failure into personal acceptance. Empires survive decline by convincing people that endurance is maturity and resistance is naivete, yet history contradicts this narrative again and again. The systems that eventually collapse are not brought down by those who believed change was impossible, they are exposed by those who refuse to accept that belief. The lie is powerful because it feels true in isolation, but it collapses the moment it is spoken aloud by many at once. We can't change anything anyway, only works as long as people say it alone. And history is not shaped by isolated thoughts. It is shaped by the moments when people realize that the lie was shared, and stop repeating it. Empires begin to believe their own story. Every empire starts with a story. It first, this story is descriptive. It explains who they are, why they exist, and how they came to power. It helps coordinate people, give meaning to sacrifice, and justify authority. In the early phase, the story follows reality closely. It adapts when conditions change. It is tested by failure and revised by experience. But as empires age, the relationship reverses. The story no longer describes reality. Reality is forced to fit the story. This is the moment when belief replaces awareness. An empire that begins to weaken cannot easily admit decline. Admission would threaten legitimacy, obedience, and cohesion. So instead of changing course, it strengthens its narrative. The story becomes louder, more polished, more repetitive. Success is emphasized, failures are reframed, and contradictions are explained away. What once functioned as explanation becomes protection. The empire no longer asks whether the story is true. It asks whether it is useful. This shift is subtle. The empire does not consciously decide to lie. It simply begins to trust its own language more than lived experience. Reports are written to match expectations, symbols are used to reinforce identity, history is selectively remembered to support continuity. The story becomes internally consistent even as it drifts away from facts. Consistency replaces accuracy. And consistency feels like stability. As belief deepens, criticism becomes harder to process, not because critics are wrong, but because they threaten narrative coherence. Any fact that contradicts the story feels hostile. The empire interprets such facts not as information, but as attacks. This is how reality itself becomes suspicious. When evidence does not fit the narrative, it is dismissed as exaggeration, misinterpretation, or malice. The story is defended not with argument but with repetition. Once an empire believes its own story, it stops learning. Stories do not learn, they repeat, they simplify, they reduce complexity into meaning. This reduction is powerful for control but fatal for adaptation. The world changes in ways the story cannot accommodate. New challenges emerge that do not resemble past victories, but the empire keeps responding as if the old script still applies. Policies are shaped by myth rather than analysis. Strategy becomes performance. This belief also reshapes leadership. Those who best embody the story rise, those who complicate it fall. Success is measured by narrative alignment rather than results. Leaders are selected for how well they speak the language of greatness, not how accurately they read conditions. The system rewards confidence over competence because confidence reinforces belief, and belief is now the empire's primary defense. For citizens, this creates a growing dissonance. People experience strain, loss, and frustration, but are told they are living inside success. This gap does not immediately produce rebellion. It produces confusion. When reality and narrative diverge, people often question themselves before they question the story. They assume the problem is personal rather than structural. The empire benefits from this delay. The story absorbs dissatisfaction and reframes it as misunderstanding or ingratitude. History shows that this phase often precedes collapse closely, because belief blinds power at the exact moment clarity is most needed. The empire mistakes its story for its strength. It assumes that as long as the narrative holds, the structure will hold, but narratives do not produce food, trust, or legitimacy, they only postpone recognition. Collapse, when it comes, feels sudden not because it was unpredictable, but because belief prevented preparation. The empire was busy maintaining meaning while losing function. It invested in symbols while neglecting systems. It defended identity while reality shifted underneath it. Empires do not fall because their stories are false, they fall because they believe them absolutely. A story that cannot be questioned becomes a prison, and when power lives inside a story instead of reality, it no longer responds to the world as it is. It responds to the world as it insists it must be. And reality always wins that conflict, eventually. Empires frame criticism as betrayal, a long analysis. One of the clearest signals that an empire has entered its declining phase is the moment criticism stops being treated as information and starts being treated as intent. What matters is no longer what is said, but why it is said, or more precisely, who is imagined to be behind it. Criticism is no longer evaluated for accuracy. It is evaluated for loyalty. This is a profound psychological shift. When systems are confident, they tolerate dissent because dissent helps correction. When systems are insecure, they reinterpret dissent as threat. Empires do not suddenly become allergic to criticism, they slowly redefine it. At first, the change is subtle. Critical voices are described as unhelpful, divisive, or negative. The content of their arguments is not addressed, their tone is questioned, then motives are introduced. Are they destabilizing morale? Are they helping enemies? Are they undermining unity? Once motive replaces substance, criticism has already lost its legitimacy. By the time dissent is openly labeled betrayal, the groundwork has long been laid. The system has trained itself to hear warning as attack. This framing serves a crucial function. Empires depend on coordination, coordination depends on trust, and trust, when mismanaged, is confused with agreement. When leaders can no longer distinguish between loyalty to truth and loyalty to authority, they collapse the two into one. The only acceptable loyalty becomes loyalty to the system's self-image. Any challenge to that image feels existential, because admitting error would mean admitting fragility, and fragility threatens obedience. So the empire protects itself not by correcting mistakes, but by criminalizing the act of naming them. Once criticism is framed as betrayal, discussion becomes impossible. Not because arguments disappear, but because the cost of making them becomes too high. People learn quickly that speaking honestly invites suspicion. Silence becomes safer than clarity. Even those who see problems clearly begin to self-censor. They soften language, delay warnings, use euphemisms, or withdraw entirely. This creates an illusion of consensus. The system appears unified because dissent has been driven underground. The absence of visible opposition is mistaken for health. This dynamic also reverses moral logic. In a healthy system, loyalty includes the duty to warn. In a declining empire, warning is reclassified as disloyalty. The critic is portrayed as someone who does not believe, does not belong, or does not care enough. Meanwhile, those who repeat official narratives, no matter how detached from reality, are praised as patriots. The system stops distinguishing between love of country and love of authority. Criticism becomes morally suspect, while conformity becomes virtuous. History shows that this transformation accelerates collapse. Once criticism is equated with betrayal, the system loses its internal corrective mechanisms. Errors multiply unchecked, policies persist long after they fail, because acknowledging failure would validate the critics, and validating critics would undermine the narrative of unity. The empire becomes trapped by its own framing. It must choose between truth and loyalty. And it consistently chooses loyalty, until reality intervenes. The deepest danger here is not repression, but misinterpretation. Empires that criminalize criticism convince themselves they are defending stability. In reality, they are dismantling their own capacity to learn. By attacking critics instead of arguments, they protect ego rather than structure. When collapse finally arrives, it feels sudden and unjust from the inside. Because no one is allowed to say what everyone already knows. Empires do not fall because they are criticized, they fall because they silence criticism and mistake silence for agreement. By the time dissent is openly called betrayal, the empire is no longer defending itself. It is defending an illusion, and illusions do not survive contact with reality. Empires treat alternatives as dangerous. When empires are stable, alternatives can be debated. When they begin to weaken, alternatives become threats. This shift reveals a deep insecurity at the core of power. An alternative is not dangerous because it is violent or radical, but because it introduces comparison, and comparison undermines inevitability. The moment people see that another path is possible, the existing system loses its claim to necessity. Empires depend on the belief that there is no other viable way to organize life. This belief does not require admiration. It only requires resignation. Alternatives disrupt that resignation. They force a question the system cannot afford to answer: why this, and not something else? As a result, empires gradually redefine alternatives as unrealistic, irresponsible, or destabilizing. New ideas are dismissed as naive, old ideas are labeled obsolete. Even hypothetical discussions are framed as dangerous distractions. The system presents itself as the only adult option in the room, while portraying alternatives as chaos. This framing shifts debate from substance to legitimacy. People stop asking whether an alternative is better and start asking whether it is allowed. This is how imagination becomes regulated. The empire does not need to crush every alternative physically. It only needs to delegitimize them culturally. Once alternatives are treated as threats, curiosity becomes suspicion, creativity becomes risk. Those who imagine different futures are portrayed as reckless, divisive, or disloyal. This isolates innovators and discourages collective exploration. The system grows intellectually rigid while claiming to protect stability. History shows that the moment alternatives are no longer discussable, adaptation ends. Empires that fear alternatives do not fall because better systems defeat them. They fall because they eliminate their own capacity to evolve, and a system that cannot imagine change will eventually encounter it unprepared. One of the most critical transformations that occurs in late-stage empires is the systematic removal of personal responsibility from power. When an empire is young, decisions are visible, authors of policies are known, success and failure are traceable to individuals or small groups. This clarity creates accountability. But as systems grow larger and more complex, this clarity becomes dangerous to those in control. Responsibility creates vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens authority. So the empire slowly restructures itself to ensure that no one is ever truly responsible. This process does not begin with dishonesty. It begins with organization. Committees are formed, procedures are standardized, decisions are routed through layers of approval. First, this appears rational, efficiency increases, risk seems distributed, but over time, distribution turns into dilution. When responsibility is shared by many, it is carried by none. No individual feels ownership over outcomes because no individual made the decision alone. Every action becomes the result of process, protocol, or institutional necessity. Language plays a crucial role here. Statements shift from "I decided" to "it was decided." From "we chose" to "the system requires." Agency disappears behind passive constructions. The empire does not deny that harm occurred. It denies that anyone caused it. This linguistic shift is not cosmetic. It rewires moral perception. People inside the system learn that safety lies in procedure, not judgment. If you follow protocol, you are protected, even if the outcome is destructive. This trains obedience while dissolving conscience. As responsibility becomes abstract, the system gains stability but loses correction. Errors persist because no one is empowered to admit them. Admitting failure would require someone to claim authorship, but authorship no longer exists. There are only roles, functions, and rules. This creates a structure that is resilient against blame but fragile against reality. The empire becomes excellent at surviving criticism because criticism cannot land anywhere. It evaporates into bureaucracy. This depersonalization also affects how power recruits and promotes. As responsibility fades, decision-making favors those who execute rather than those who evaluate. The safest individuals are not thinkers but implementers. Those who act within instructions advance faster than those who question outcomes. Over time, this reshapes the character of leadership. Positions are filled by people skilled at navigating process rather than understanding consequence. The system becomes technically competent but morally hollow. For citizens, this creates profound alienation. Harm is experienced, but accountability is inaccessible. There is no face to confront, no decision to challenge. Every complaint is redirected into forms, departments, and waiting periods. This produces exhaustion rather than resistance. The empire does not silence people, it buries them in procedure. This is far more effective. A system without visible responsibility cannot be opposed meaningfully, because opposition requires a target. History shows that this pattern appears repeatedly in declining empires, late Roman administration, imperial bureaucracies, and modern technocratic states all exhibit this trait. They replace responsibility with governance, they confuse management with morality. When injustice occurs, it is treated as malfunction rather than choice, and malfunctions do not require apology, they require adjustment. This framing allows the system to continue indefinitely without confronting its ethical failures. The most dangerous consequence of depersonalized responsibility is the loss of learning. Systems learn by recognizing error and correcting behavior, but correction requires ownership. When no one owns decisions, no one learns from them. Mistakes repeat with confidence. The empire continues to act confident that it followed the rules, even as outcomes worsen. Collapse, when it finally arrives, feels unfair from the inside. No single betrayal caused it. No obvious villain can be blamed. This leads to confusion and denial. People ask how such a large organized system could fail without anyone doing anything wrong. The answer is simple: nothing went wrong individually. Everyone did their job. The collapse was produced collectively by a structure that eliminated responsibility so effectively that it eliminated the capacity to change. Empires do not depersonalize responsibility by accident, they do it to protect themselves from instability, but in doing so, they protect themselves from accountability, adaptation, and ultimately survival. A system that cannot say, "I was wrong," cannot say, "I must change." And a system that cannot change does not need enemies to fall. It only needs time. Professionalism is replaced by loyalty. In the healthy phase of an empire, professionalism is essential. Skill, experience, and competence keep the system connected to reality. People who understand their field can recognize problems early, interpret signals accurately, and adjust decisions before damage becomes irreversible. In this stage, mistakes are costly, and ignorance is dangerous. But as power stabilizes and insecurity grows, the system's priorities quietly shift. What once mattered most, accuracy, becomes secondary to what now feels safer, control. Professionalism begins to look risky because it brings questions, and questions expose weaknesses. Loyalty, by contrast, is predictable. It does not challenge assumptions. It confirms existing narratives, and confirmation feels comforting to a system afraid of disruption. As a result, empires slowly begin to reward alignment over ability. This change is rarely declared openly. It happens through promotions, access, and trust. People advance not because they are the most capable, but because they are the least threatening. Those who notice contradictions are labeled difficult, those who warn early are framed as pessimistic or disloyal. Their competence becomes a liability. Bakarikli and Sandler Yasuzmaga Mabur Oler, Yadanara Killer, Zilri y Gunlasir, Bilikorini Yumsaldir, Delini Filtran Kesserir. Die Grori is Systemi Trk Eder. Buproses Institutionalari Zahirn Dalu Saxlayer, Ama Daxeln Bozalder. Krarler Veriler, Ama on Laus Azler, Ikra Sirtelnir, Ama Istikamdieter, System Vahid Garuner, Ama Bu Vahidlichtnknin Yak Slugiter. Loyalty creates unity without correction, while professionalism creates correction without safety. When loyalty wins, the system sacrifices learning for comfort. Errors multiply, but no one is accountable because everyone followed orders. Responsibility dissolves into procedure. The empire continues to function mechanically, confident yet blind. History shows that this is a late-stage pattern. When competence is treated as danger and loyalty as virtue, the system no longer adapts. It repeats itself in a changing world, and repetition under new conditions is not stability. It is slow collapse. Empires do not fall when they lose talent, they fall when they decide talent is dangerous, and once that decision becomes habit, collapse no longer needs an enemy. It only needs time. Skilled people are pushed aside, loyal people rise. A long analysis. In every empire's early phase, competence is survival, skill is not optional, it is existential. The system depends on people who can read reality accurately, anticipate consequences, and adjust behavior when conditions change. Errors are costly, and ignorance is punished by failure. But as power stabilizes and time passes, this relationship reverses. What once threatened survival, mistakes, becomes less frightening than what now threatens authority. Disruption. Skilled individuals disrupt by nature, not because they seek conflict, but because competence requires perception. To understand reality is to notice when it no longer aligns with official narratives. This makes skill inherently dangerous to aging systems. Loyalty, by contrast, is predictable. It does not challenge assumptions. It does not expose contradictions. It does not force uncomfortable re-evaluations. Loyal people repeat what is already accepted, they protect the continuity of power rather than the accuracy of decisions, and continuity feels safer than truth when a system becomes fragile. This is the psychological pivot. At the moment an empire begins to fear instability more than failure, it begins selecting for loyalty over ability. This selection is rarely explicit. No law announces it. No decree admits it. It emerges quietly through incentives: who gets promoted, who gets access, who is trusted with influence. The pattern becomes clear long before it is spoken. Competent individuals notice problems early, they see inefficiencies before they become crises, they warn when policies no longer fit reality, but early warnings are inconvenient, they force acknowledgement before damage is undeniable, and acknowledgement threatens reputations, legitimacy, and hierarchy. So the system responds defensively, not by addressing the warning but by reframing the warner. Skilled critics are labeled pessimistic, uncooperative, or politically unreliable. Their tone is questioned rather than their content, their motives are scrutinized rather than their evidence. This gradually teaches a lesson: accuracy carries risk. At the same time, those who demonstrate loyalty are rewarded, they are praised for being team players, for maintaining morale, for supporting decisions without hesitation. Their agreement is interpreted as stability, their silence as wisdom. This creates a distorted feedback loop. Decision makers hear less resistance and interpret this as success. They assume policies are working because dissent has diminished. In reality, dissent has simply been filtered out. The system becomes calm on the surface while losing depth underneath. Over time, this dynamic reshapes institutions. Competent people face a choice: adapt or exit. Some lower their standards and learn to speak the approved language. Others withdraw entirely, leaving behind positions once defined by expertise. Now those positions are filled by individuals selected primarily for reliability and alignment. The system still functions, but only mechanically. It executes plans efficiently while understanding them poorly. Procedures are followed precisely while consequences are ignored. This is why late-stage empires often appear highly organized yet strangely incompetent. They enforce rules rigorously while failing to grasp reality. Loyalty-based systems also distort responsibility. When outcomes are bad, no one is accountable because no one made an independent judgment. Everyone followed instructions, everyone complied. This dispersal of responsibility protects individuals while hollowing the system. Intelligence becomes fragmented. No one is allowed to see the whole picture, because seeing the whole picture would require questioning it. The empire moves confidently in the wrong direction, convinced of its unity. The tragedy is that this process feels rational from the inside. Surrounded by agreement, leaders feel validated. Surrounded by loyalty, they feel secure. The absence of contradiction is mistaken for consensus, but consensus without competence is collapse delayed, not avoided. When loyalty replaces professionalism, the system sacrifices learning for comfort. And a system that no longer learns cannot adapt to change. It can only repeat itself until repetition becomes failure. History shows this pattern relentlessly. From imperial courts to modern bureaucracies, the moment skill is treated as a liability and loyalty as a virtue, decline accelerates, not because enemies grow stronger, but because the system grows blind. Empires do not fall when they lose talent, they fall when they decide talent is dangerous, and once that decision becomes habit, collapse no longer needs pressure. It only needs time. One of the clearest signs of systemic decline is not economic collapse or military defeat, but linguistic distortion. As empires weaken, their language begins to drift away from lived reality. The words used by the state no longer describe what people experience, they reinterpret it. Instead of naming problems directly, official language softens, deflects, and reframes. Crisis becomes challenge. Loss becomes restructuring. Failure becomes transition. This is not mere rhetoric. It is a survival mechanism. Language is the bridge between perception and action. When that bridge is altered, action is delayed. By renaming deterioration, the system reduces emotional impact. people are less likely to react strongly to something that sounds technical or temporary. This linguistic shift allows authorities to appear calm, competent, and in control, even as conditions worsen. The state does not lie outright. It speaks in a dialect designed to minimize urgency. This creates a split reality. Citizens live one experience and hear another. They feel pressure while being told stability exists. This dissonance breeds confusion rather than resistance, because language no longer validates experience. When people cannot name what is happening, they struggle to organize against it. Over time, official terms replace lived descriptions. People begin to speak in the system's vocabulary even when it contradicts their own senses. This internalization is critical. Once language is captured, thought follows. When the state's words dominate, the ability to articulate alternative interpretations fades. Reality becomes difficult to express outside approved terms. The empire does not silence opposition. It exhausts it linguistically. By the time collapse becomes undeniable, the language available to describe it is already compromised. The system loses not only control of reality, but the capacity to acknowledge it, and when language can no longer tell the truth, truth loses its power to mobilize. In the early stages of an empire, competence matters. Survival depends on skill, judgment, and the ability to respond accurately to reality. But as systems age, loyalty gradually overtakes professionalism. This shift does not happen because competence disappears, but because competence becomes risky. Professionals see patterns. They notice inconsistencies. They ask questions. Loyalty, by contrast, does not challenge. It reassures. As insecurity grows within the system, those in power begin to value alignment over ability. People are promoted not for what they understand, but for what they affirm. This creates a silent inversion. Expertise becomes a threat. Silence becomes a virtue. Decision-making spaces fill with individuals who agree rather than analyze. The system feels safer because it hears fewer objections, but it also becomes weaker because it receives less truth. Over time, this selection process reshapes institutions. Competent individuals either adapt by lowering their standards or exit altogether. Those who remain learn that advancement depends on obedience, not excellence. As a result, errors multiply while confidence remains high. The empire continues to act decisively, but without accuracy. This is why late-stage empires often appear both rigid and incompetent. They enforce rules strictly while failing to understand their consequences. Loyalty creates unity without intelligence. Professionalism creates insight without protection. When loyalty wins, the system trades learning for comfort, and a system that no longer learns does not need enemies to fail. It only needs time. As systems begin to fail, people develop a powerful expectation that there will be a clear, dramatic moment when everything becomes undeniable. This belief is comforting. It allows individuals to postpone action while preserving the feeling of awareness that the final moment is imagined as a visible threshold. An event so severe that it forces change automatically. Until that moment arrives, inaction feels reasonable. This mindset is deeply psychological. It protects people from the burden of decision-making. Acting early requires uncertainty and risk. Waiting for a final signal transfers responsibility to events themselves. If nothing catastrophic has happened yet, then the situation must still be tolerable. This logic slowly trains societies to endure rather than intervene. The danger is that collapse rarely produces such a moment. From the inside, decline appears gradual, fragmented, and ambiguous. Each worsening feels incremental, never decisive. People keep recalibrating their tolerance. They adjust expectations downward and reinterpret discomfort as temporary. This creates a moving threshold that the final moment keeps being postponed because reality never matches the imagined drama. By the time conditions are severe enough to feel unambiguous, the capacity to respond has already been eroded. Institutions are weaker, resources are depleted. Trust is gone. What people waited for was clarity, but clarity arrives too late. The belief in a final moment is one of the most effective ways collapse disguises itself. It turns awareness into delay and delay into habit. History shows that societies do not fail because they miss warning signs. They fail because they wait for permission to act, and that permission never comes. A new generation arrives, but old mechanisms remain. Why collapse is delayed and deepened. Every empire eventually reaches a moment that feels like renewal. A new generation appears, younger faces enter institutions, new language emerges, new technology spreads, new cultural symbols replace old ones. From the outside, this looks like progress. from the inside, it feels like hope, but history shows a recurring pattern. While generations change, mechanisms remain. And when mechanisms remain unchanged, the arrival of a new generation does not prevent decline, it stabilizes it. At first, this seems paradoxical. Youth is associated with energy, rebellion, and transformation. So why does the system survive instead of being challenged? Because systems rarely fall from lack of new people, they fall when new people stop imagining different structures. The most effective way an empire prolongs its life is not by suppressing the young, but by absorbing them. When a new generation enters an aging system, they encounter rules, habits, and hierarchies that existed long before them. These mechanisms present themselves as neutral realities rather than historical choices. They are framed as how things work, not as things that can be reworked. The young are told, implicitly or explicitly, that change must come slowly, carefully, and from within. But from within often means never fundamentally. The system does not ask the new generation to believe in it. It asks them to function inside it, and functionality is easier than resistance. Young people quickly learn the cost of confrontation. Questioning too directly leads to exclusion, criticizing structure leads to marginalization. Those who want influence are encouraged to be pragmatic, to compromise, to wait their turn. This creates a powerful psychological recalibration. Idealism is reinterpreted as immaturity, realism becomes synonymous with acceptance. The system rewards adaptation and punishes disruption, not violently, but administratively. Careers advance through compliance, visibility comes through alignment. Over time, ambition replaces vision. This is how generational change becomes cosmetic. New people operate old machines, they bring fresh language to outdated logic, new aesthetics wrap ancient power structures. The system appears modernized while remaining fundamentally unchanged. This produces a dangerous illusion that renewal is happening when only replacement is. This illusion is convincing because daily life continues, institutions remain staffed, decisions are still made, the surface looks dynamic, but beneath it, the same incentives, the same hierarchies, and the same blind spots persist. What makes this stage especially dangerous is that it reduces urgency. Older generations may remember decline and feel anxiety, younger generations know only the weakened version of the system. They treat erosion as normal. Because they never experienced better, they do not feel the loss, they adapt their expectations downward. This adaptation is not cowardice, it is survival, but survival inside a failing structure trains people to manage decline rather than challenge it. The question shifts from, why is this broken, to, how do I live with this? As a result, collapse slows, but it also deepens. Immediate breakdown is postponed because the system has new energy, new workers, new administrators, new believers. But the underlying problems are not addressed, they are stabilized. Long-term decay becomes normalized, the empire buys time at the cost of depth, the future is not prepared, it is consumed. This process also reshapes responsibility. When young people adapt rather than transform, they inherit mechanisms without owning them, they become operators, not authors, they execute rules they did not design and defend structures they did not choose. This creates moral distance. If outcomes are unjust, the blame feels abstract, the system predates them, they merely function within it. This distance protects individuals but weakens collective accountability. No generation feels responsible enough to rebuild. History shows that empires often appear strongest just before they fail, because they are most populated, most organized, and most staffed at that moment. But strength without flexibility is rigidity, and rigidity breaks suddenly. When collapse finally arrives, it shocks the young most of all, because they believed adaptation was stability, they thought survival meant safety, they mistook continuity for durability. The tragedy is not that the new generation fails to act, the tragedy is that the system succeeds in teaching them that acting differently is unrealistic. By the time that belief settles in, collapse is no longer resisted. It is managed, delayed, and absorbed, until delay becomes impossible. This is why the arrival of a new generation does not save declining empires. It often preserves them just long enough to ensure a deeper fall. The old mechanisms remain, the young adapt, and collapse, postponed but unchallenged, becomes structural rather than sudden. Empires do not fall when generations change, they fall when generations stop imagining change as possible, and when that happens, the end does not come quickly. It comes quietly, patiently, and all at once. In the modern world, the dynamic between cruelty and mercy has not disappeared. It has changed form. Power no longer relies only on physical punishment or visible violence. It often operates through language, media, narrative, and perception, but the psychological mechanism remains the same. Cruelty still appears decisive, mercy still appears risky. And societies under pressure still gravitate toward what feels immediately stabilizing rather than what builds slowly over time. Today, cruelty does not always look like public execution or conquest. It can look like aggressive rhetoric, polarizing discourse, public humiliation, or uncompromising policy. It appears as the leader who speaks loudly, acts swiftly, and promises order without delay. This type of power feels strong because it eliminates ambiguity. It tells people what to fear and whom to blame. It divides the world into clear sides. Clarity reduces anxiety. And in an age of constant information overload, clarity feels like relief. The modern environment intensifies this effect because visibility has multiplied. Social media amplifies spectacle, algorithms reward intensity, outrage spreads faster than nuance. A harsh statement can dominate attention within minutes. A measured response rarely travels as far. Cruelty fits the architecture of attention, mercy does not. Cruelty generates engagement, mercy generates reflection. And reflection is slower, quieter, and less shareable. Political culture reflects this shift. Leaders who project forceful certainty are often perceived as strong, even when their policies lack depth. Empathetic language is frequently framed as weakness or indecision. Public debate rewards confrontation over collaboration. The loudest voice can dominate discourse, not because it is correct, but because it is visible. This creates a cycle. Visibility is mistaken for authority. Authority is mistaken for competence. At the same time, the tools of control have become more sophisticated. Fear in the modern world is not only physical. It is economic, social, and psychological. Job insecurity, reputation risk, cultural anxiety. These pressures shape behavior quietly. People self-censor not because they face immediate punishment, but because they anticipate consequences. This anticipatory fear mirrors older systems of visible terror, but it is subtler and often internalized. Power does not need to shout constantly. It needs only to remain possible. Yet the modern world also reveals the limits of cruelty more quickly. Information flows in multiple directions, feedback cannot be suppressed as easily, global interconnectedness makes isolation difficult. Systems built purely on fear struggle to maintain legitimacy when exposed to scrutiny. Trust becomes increasingly valuable because transparency increases vulnerability. Power that relies only on intimidation cannot adapt to this level of visibility. Mercy in the modern world requires even greater courage because it operates against the speed of reaction. To show restraint in a viral moment is to risk being misunderstood. To choose dialogue over punishment is to risk appearing passive. But long-term stability still depends on legitimacy, not spectacle. Societies that build trust endure polarization more effectively than those that intensify it. Trust creates social capital absorbs shocks, fear amplifies them. Modern crises, economic downturns, pandemics, cultural conflicts, reveal this contrast sharply. In moments of panic, the demand for harsh control increases, people seek protection. But once the immediate danger subsides, they evaluate fairness. They remember whether authority acted with proportionality or excess. Cruelty may stabilize a moment, but mercy determines memory. And memory shapes future loyalty. The philosophical tension persists. Cruelty is visible strength, mercy is invisible strength. One satisfies urgency, the other sustains continuity. The modern world magnifies urgency through constant exposure to threat. It accelerates reaction and compresses patience. This environment favors loud power, yet it also increases fragility. Systems that escalate intensity to maintain attention exhaust themselves. Systems that cultivate legitimacy quietly endure. In the end, the modern world does not eliminate the ancient pattern. It exposes it more clearly. We still mistake aggression for decisiveness. We still interpret restraint as weakness. But we also see more rapidly the consequences of those mistakes. Cruelty may dominate headlines, mercy shapes institutions. The question today is not whether cruelty can control. It can. The question is whether control without trust can survive in a world where perception changes instantly and legitimacy erodes quickly. Modern power must choose between spectacle and sustainability. the first wins attention, the second wins time, and time remains the ultimate measure of strength. Collapse rarely announces itself through chaos at first. It hides behind normality. As systems begin to decay, they quietly redefine what it means to be a normal person. Normal no longer means thoughtful, engaged, or responsible. It means adjusted, compliant, functional enough to keep things moving. The normal person is the one who adapts without questioning, who survives without interrupting, and who learns how to live inside decline without naming it. This redefinition is not accidental. It is one of the most effective tools empires use to mask their own deterioration. When decline begins, systems do not immediately demand belief, they demand behavior. They reward those who keep routines intact, who do not disrupt order with uncomfortable questions, who accept limitations as facts of life rather than signs of failure. Over time, normality becomes moral. People are no longer judged by whether they see clearly, but by whether they behave acceptably. Too concerned is framed as panic. To be critical is framed as negativity. To be alarmed is framed as immaturity. The normal person is calm, not because there is no danger, but because calmness signals loyalty. This creates a psychological filter, where warning once produced urgency, it now produces embarrassment. Nobody wants to be the one who overreacts. Nobody wants to look irrational in a world that values composure over truth. So people adjust their perceptions to match expectations. They stop trusting what they feel and begin trusting what is socially approved. The most dangerous aspect of this process is that it feels reasonable. Life continues, markets open, work is done, rituals repeat, the visible surface of society remains intact, and this surface activity is mistaken for health. Normal people point to this continuity as evidence that concerns are exaggerated. If things were truly collapsing, they assume, it would feel dramatic. It would look like crisis. But collapse rarely looks like crisis from the inside. It looks like inconvenience, declining standards, and shrinking possibilities that arrive gradually enough to be absorbed. What the idea of the normal person does is remove contrast. When everyone adapts to a lower baseline, that baseline becomes invisible. What was once unacceptable becomes expected. What was once alarming becomes manageable. The system no longer needs to suppress dissent aggressively, because dissent now violates normality. People police themselves and each other. The sentence, "This is just how things are," becomes the final argument. Normality turns structural failure into personal responsibility. If you struggle, it is because you failed to adapt. If you are uncomfortable, it is because your expectations are outdated. The system is never wrong. Only individuals are insufficiently flexible. This psychological shift is crucial, because once collapse is framed as normal life, there is nothing left to resist. You cannot fight what you have accepted as reality. Empires do not need universal belief to survive decline, they only need enough people to behave normally while the foundations erode underneath them, and history shows this pattern clearly. The moment a society prioritizes being normal over being aware, it has already chosen endurance over correction. That choice does not stop collapse. It only makes sure that when collapse finally becomes undeniable, there is no longer a language to describe it, let alone the courage to prevent it. A new generation arrives, but old mechanisms remain. Why collapse is delayed and deepened. Every empire eventually reaches a moment that feels like renewal. A new generation appears, younger faces enter institutions, new language emerges, new technology spreads, new cultural symbols replace old ones. From the outside, this looks like progress. From the inside, it feels like hope. But history shows a recurring pattern. While generations change, mechanisms remain. And when mechanisms remain unchanged, the arrival of a new generation does not prevent decline, it stabilizes it. At first, this seems paradoxical. Youth is associated with energy, rebellion, and transformation. So why does the system survive instead of being challenged? Because systems rarely fall from lack of new people, they fall when new people stop imagining different structures. The most effective way an empire prolongs its life is not by suppressing the young, but by absorbing them. When a new generation enters an aging system, they encounter rules, habits, and hierarchies that existed long before them. These mechanisms present themselves as neutral realities rather than historical choices. They are framed as how things work, not as things that can be reworked. The young are told, implicitly or explicitly, that change must come slowly, carefully, and from within. But from within often means never fundamentally. The system does not ask the new generation to believe in it. It asks them to function inside it, and functionality is easier than resistance. Young people quickly learn the cost of confrontation. Questioning too directly leads to exclusion, criticizing structure leads to marginalization. Those who want influence are encouraged to be pragmatic, to compromise, to wait their turn. This creates a powerful psychological recalibration. Idealism is reinterpreted as immaturity, realism becomes synonymous with acceptance. The system rewards adaptation and punishes disruption, not violently, but administratively. Careers advance through compliance, visibility comes through alignment. Over time, ambition replaces vision. This is how generational change becomes cosmetic. New people operate old machines, they bring fresh language to outdated logic, new aesthetics wrap ancient power structures. The system appears modernized while remaining fundamentally unchanged. This produces a dangerous illusion that renewal is happening when only replacement is. This illusion is convincing because daily life continues, institutions remain staffed, decisions are still made, the surface looks dynamic, but beneath it, the same incentives, the same hierarchies, and the same blind spots persist. What makes this stage especially dangerous is that it reduces urgency. Older generations may remember decline and feel anxiety, younger generations know only the weakened version of the system. They treat erosion as normal. Because they never experienced better, they do not feel the loss, they adapt their expectations downward. This adaptation is not cowardice, it is survival, but survival inside a failing structure trains people to manage decline rather than challenge it. The question shifts from, "Why is this broken?" to, "How do I live with this?" As a result, collapse slows, but it also deepens. Immediate breakdown is postponed because the system has new energy, new workers, new administrators, new believers. But the underlying problems are not addressed, they are stabilized. Long-term decay becomes normalized, the empire buys time at the cost of depth, the future is not prepared, it is consumed. This process also reshapes responsibility. When young people adapt rather than transform, they inherit mechanisms without owning them, they become operators, not authors, they execute rules they did not design and defend structures they did not choose. This creates moral distance. If outcomes are unjust, the blame feels abstract, the system predates them, they merely function within it. This distance protects individuals but weakens collective accountability. No generation feels responsible enough to rebuild. History shows that empires often appear strongest just before they fail, because they are most populated, most organized, and most staffed at that moment. But strength without flexibility is rigidity, and rigidity breaks suddenly. When collapse finally arrives, it shocks the young most of all, because they believed adaptation was stability, they thought survival meant safety, they mistook continuity for durability. The tragedy is not that the new generation fails to act, the tragedy is that the system succeeds in teaching them that acting differently is unrealistic. By the time that belief settles in, collapse is no longer resisted. It is managed, delayed, and absorbed, until delay becomes impossible. This is why the arrival of a new generation does not save declining empires. It often preserves them just long enough to ensure a deeper fall. The old mechanisms remain, the young adapt, and collapse, postponed but unchallenged, becomes structural rather than sudden. Empires do not fall when generations change, they fall when generations stop imagining change as possible, and when that happens, the end does not come quickly. It comes quietly, patiently, and all at once. Cruelty has always looked powerful because it is loud, immediate, and visible. Mercy has always looked fragile because it is quiet, slow, and unseen. But history shows a different truth. Cruelty can command behavior for a moment. Mercy shapes belief over time. One controls through fear, the other endures through legitimacy. Empires, leaders, and societies repeatedly choose cruelty when they feel threatened because fear promises instant order. Mercy asks for patience, and patience feels risky in uncertain times, yet every system built only on fear eventually collapses under its own weight. Silence is not stability, obedience is not loyalty, and power that cannot exist without intimidation is already insecure. If this video made you question how strength is defined, how fear disguises itself as control, and why mercy is often misunderstood, then stay with us. This channel explores history not as a list of events, but as repeating human patterns. Subscribe for more deep historical and philosophical analysis. Like the video if these ideas made you think. Comment what you believe creates real strength in societies, fear or trust. History does not repeat itself exactly. But human behavior rarely changes.